if people outside of neurodivergent, the neurodivergent realm could be more curious about the internal state of autistics and ADHDers and other people, if they could be more curious, if they could see it as more of like maybe there's just a cultural difference between how we're displaying empathy, and maybe I need to sort of reach across and try to understand how they're demonstrating it, right? Then I think we would bridge things a lot more. Hello and welcome to the Trauma Informed SLP. I am Kim Neely. I am a licensed speech language pathologist in the United States. That's what the SLP stands for. I'm also neuroqueer, so neurodivergent and queer, multiply neurodivergent. And I have this really big hyperfixation with trauma-informed care and a real big interest in psychology. I have some background in neuroscience when it comes to at least a couple years of a PhD. So I can unpack some stuff in that realm as well, and I love info dumping. So here I am on YouTube, info dumping. If you're new here, I talk a lot with my hands. I have a little fidget/stim that I use. He's a little octopus that changes. He has a little angry face when he's turned in and out, but he gives me some pressure on my fingers. That's a nice stim for me. The squeezing is a nice fidget, and the softness is also a really nice stim. So, and he's quiet. So if I'm talking with my hands and you see this guy fly up, that's what he is. And this is another video in my Welcome to Your Late Diagnosis Neurodivergence series and playlist, because I know a lot of adult neurodivergents, when we get our late diagnosis, there might be a lot of different emotional reactions, but some of it is like, well, now I want to understand more of how this impacts me, maybe how it might impact my kids. If you're an adult, a parent who received their diagnosis, maybe after their kid got one, because that's fairly common. But yeah, that's what this series is for. It's a playlist. I'm probably going to put up a little thingy for you to click on, whichever corner that shows up on. If you want to check out the whole playlist, go right ahead. This is, I think, the second, well, probably more like the third video of the social awareness and acceptance side of my little personal Venn diagram model of how I think of neurodivergent affirming care, at least when it comes to communication support and speech language pathology aspects and things like that. Which means I think it is important for neurodivergents to develop some level of awareness for systemic issues, struggles we have with how society is built, who it's built for, how that impacts us when it comes to schooling and access to things and consistent job and employment and stuff like that. And so that's what we're kind of unpacking here. I did do a video on systemic oppression, if you would like to check that out. If I start to say some things that you don't quite understand, some terms or something I'm using, I likely talked about it in that video. And if not, drop a comment below and a question. Actually, this is something I'm horrible at doing, but if you're here and, if at any point in this time you think, this is pretty decent stuff, like, go ahead and hit subscribe and like if you haven't already. And if you really want to put in a comment below with either a question or a statement, let me know what was useful to you, or if you have questions or other topics you would like me to talk about, please drop that in a comment below. It really helps with that's kind of how YouTube algorithm really works in terms of pushing videos out to more people. It's just knowing that people are like, yeah, I like this, or yeah, I'm going to subscribe to this person. They put out good content. Okay. If not enough people subscribe or not enough people like or engage, YouTube just assumes the video is crap and like doesn't recommend it essentially. So it would really help me out. I'm a little weird for algorithms, and I'm also like a little older and don't really quite get the whole social media jam. I really just want to be like an educator rather than like an influencer. I'm not really trying to like influence per se. So yeah, feel free to do that. I should probably let you know. Okay, back to this issue. So I also have an unmasking video as well that unpacks a little bit of some of this that relates to like societal stuff and where we learn to mask and things like that. But on this particular video, we are going to talk about the double empathy problem. The double empathy problem gets talked about a lot in neurodivergent circles, and especially in autistic circles with autistic advocates and such, mostly because I think it's really been researched more with autism than it has other neurodivergencies. But there is some more current research that includes ADHDers and some other neurodivergencies within this. So the way I want to explain double empathy problem in this video, I've kind of chunked it out by I'll introduce what it is, I'll define it for you, but then I want to give you some historical context within autism research as to why this concept got introduced and why it kind of took off the way it took off, okay? And we're also going to talk about what empathy actually is when it comes to cognitive science and psychology, that there's actually three core components to empathy, which often is not thought about that way in colloquial use of the term empathy. So I do want to mention that, which we'll get into in a little bit. And then we're going to talk about kind of the insights that have developed from research that came out of this concept being presented, and just sort of where the current state of research and evidence is and the kind of information that's out there about that. And I probably very likely will sprinkle in some of my own experiences and talk about how it kind of overlaps a little bit with like social stuff and society and that sort of thing. Okay. So let's go ahead and get into it. All right. The double empathy problem is a term or a concept that was originally, at least in research circles, it was originally introduced by Dr. Damien Milton in a paper that he put out in 2012. And I believe from having seen like interviews and read like articles, like interview articles essentially that he's done with certain reporters and such, I believe he said that it came about from, there was like a support group for autistics that he either was in the support group or he was leading it. I'm not sure which. I can't remember. And that this concept got talked about a lot. And he honestly can't remember if he came up with the term or if it was sort of a, everybody sort of came up with, somebody else in the group kind of came up with it. But being a researcher over in the UK, which he still is a researcher over in the United Kingdom, he put it in a paper. So he gets credited with it, academically speaking. Okay. So essentially, this was a concept he was using to try to describe the way that misunderstandings seem to occur between autistics and allistics, or at least people who are not autistic, allistic. So we're not even talking neurotypical, just autistic and other people. And how there can be this like critical misunderstanding of like the autistic is perceiving something one way and feeling one way internally about something, and the other person interprets it in a completely opposite way from how the autistic experienced it and felt about it. And then it creates a lot of miscommunication and misunderstanding and just clashes, right? So that was sort of the idea behind this, is that looking for a way to try to explain that maybe there's just a fundamental difference there between autistics and allistics versus it being a lack of something, right? So introducing it more as that maybe we're just looking at a brain difference here for some of this, right? So we're taking this out of, we're not really discussing disability in the social realm or in the medical realm at the moment. We're really just talking about like, maybe the cognitive science got it wrong. Essentially, it was kind of where this concept came from. So let's get a little into that. Let me give you some of that historical context as to why that was important, okay? The whole history of like scientific research into autism was really founded upon typically older white men, like professors and such, observing autistic children and then just sort of like writing about their observations in those autistic children and what they see and don't see in terms of behaviors. And then the real key part is they interpreted those behaviors under this sort of neurotypical slash allistic social expectations of what those behaviors mean, right? So they kind of projected a meaning onto the behaviors, even, anything that was sort of out of the box, right? Which meant that for the longest time, even in my field, people were trained, in a lot of different medical fields, quite frankly, and medically adjacent fields, rehab fields, training programs, treatment programs, all of these things started to develop under the idea that autistics lacked an ability to take the perspective of other people, which is like a theory of mind thing, right? So like you can't really put yourself in someone else's shoes. there was the thought that autistics don't have that capability and that they don't have empathy at all, possibly, right? And so it emphasized this deficit model where it was like, okay, the autistic kids are lacking all of these things, therefore we need to teach them all of these things in order to like cure them or make them better, basically. Essentially looking at it through this very pathological lens, right? Pathologizing it as like this is a disease or a disorder, and here's what we have to do to fix it. This like really binary, we see a problem, we want to cure it, right? And what more recent research has done, especially coming from this line of the double empathy problem, is looking more toward a salutogenic kind of lens where you're looking at the whole person and you actually want to take into consideration that person's internal world and their experience of the world and their own perceptions of situations, and then take this like holistic approach around maybe helping them to understand some things, but also bridging things like miscommunication, right? And advocating and giving more education toward people so that there can be less of that butting of heads in certain situations, right? So we wanted to shift, the idea was to shift the field, like scientific research and treatment paradigms and stuff based in that research, shifting it away from the idea that autistics just don't have any empathy and, you know, they're like antisocial personality disorder is basically synonymous with it and there's no hope there, and you know, or we just have to like train them to act appropriately with empathy even though they don't feel it. It's like you're method acting them or something. Is that method?
My method, something like this. Sir Ian, action. Wizard, you shall not pass. Cut. Sir Ian.
So obviously that doesn't really work, right? It's giving a little conversion therapy for queers, right? It's given a little, you know, I can teach you how to be a completely different person and you'll never have any sort of instinct to actually be who you are, how your personality is and how your brain is wired, right? So there was actually somebody who put out this really great like response to kind of the DSM-5 like criteria for autistic diagnosis that was like neurotypical disorder. If I can find it, I'll put it up on the screen here. But it was kind of a great example of this. Like if you flip the script and you try to train a neurotypical person to like STEM and get really into repetitive activities and really hyper focus on things and info dump on people, that would probably be very hard for neurotypical to do, right? Because you're teaching them to, you're trying to train them to behave in a way that is not instinctual at all. And that's essentially what a lot of treatments and therapies were doing for autistics for a very long time there. And that's all based in this sort of societal expectations, and that, you know, basically way back in like early 20th century, mid 20th century, when autism even got labeled first as a disorder, which it was first put under the category of schizophrenia as a type of schizophrenia. We have now separated it because it is different, right? Somebody could have both, but it's still separate things, really. At that time in science, especially when it comes to psychology and behavioral science, it was really all about the experts just interpreting stuff and saying this is what it is, right? There wasn't a lot of awareness on this whole like maybe we should consider the perspective of the actual people we're studying. You know? I mean, this is the time and era of like those really awful ethical violating like orphan studies where they would like take an orphan and like treat them horribly and then see what would happen. This we're talking that era, okay? Science, there's a little more ethical stuff built into science these days in most countries because of this whole history of like major ethical violations that are just awful when you read that stuff. So why valid that maybe we need to take a different tact on how we study these things, right? I think that's kind of valid, you know. So we're not doing stuff like that. Coming out of that, Damian Milton, he started putting out research more on what is the actual autistic experience of these social interactions? What is their perspective? It's like that novel, crazy idea of actually ask that person how they're experiencing things. For another example of how this works with science, I actually have a podcast episode, which I could link as well, on female hysteria in the late 19th century and how that tied into trauma research, but also like at that time, nobody was asking the women what they were thinking or feeling until like Freud and some other psychologists came in and actually asked them, and they started to discover something, but then society told them not to publish it, and then it got buried for like nearly 100 years. So if you're interested in that and like the history of science and how this kind of stuff ties in with societal stuff, that's a pretty good episode, actually. I would say. I think I did pretty good on that one. So give that one a listen. It's just audio only. That was a little side note from other scientific stuff. But essentially, what the double empathy problem gave researchers insight into is the idea to start thinking of communication and social interactions as a two-way street. Novel, I know. But yeah, communication requires somebody sending a message and someone receiving that message. That is communication in a nutshell. And I do have a much older video, which is not done as well, but I do go into some of explaining communication and language differences. I can redo that if you would like me to. Drop a comment below if you really want me to go into more of the difference between communication and language, because those two things they get jumbled together a lot in colloquial world. But in my profession, especially, communication is essentially a big umbrella term, okay? So communication includes facial expressions, it includes body language, it includes all of that stuff, okay? And when you think about it, also like communication with like a pet, right? Like maybe you can pick up on what your pet wants based off of where they're standing and where they're looking, right? It's communication. It's not really language. Language is a type of communication that's very formalized, has a lot of rules, is a lot more complex, and therefore it allows for much more nuanced understanding of things, okay? And nuanced messages being sent. Communication's a little more broad, okay? It's more of an umbrella term that a language is under, if that makes sense. So we're talking about communication in terms of, especially with empathy, we're talking like facial expressions and body language and the tone of voice you use in responding to someone about things, right? Like these are all ways we demonstrate empathy to people. And what Damian Milton was proposing and what a lot of the research now has shown is that essentially autistics demonstrate it differently. Neurotypicals misunderstand their own, like an autistic attempting to demonstrate empathy, it'll come off very differently to a neurotypical, and vice versa. So it is a two-way street. Neurotypicals don't understand the autistics have trouble understanding a neurotypical way of demonstrating empathy. Okay? So it results in these really common misconceptions of things like whether someone is happy or if they're sad, or is that sarcasm you just used, right? Now, I'm really good at sarcasm and dry humor, but I've actually learned over time to always like verbalize in any setting, like, I'm just kidding, I'm just kidding. Because at a certain point in like kind of my teenage years, I started doing really dry sarcasm to the point where people thought I was serious and I was just really mean all the time. And actually, I was trying to make jokes, but I didn't understand that not everybody could catch it. La la la. Right. And so, like, now I still do that where, like, I will say something and then I'm like, I'm just messing with you. That was just a joke, you know? Like, oh, sarcasm. Sorry. No, just being sarcastic. And I, put on a smile and, kind of do that sort of like social posturing to show I'm not actually trying to be mean here, right? Because some autistics are really good at sarcasm. Like, if you want a better example, what is that one? It's like the Onion for autism. I think it's the Daily Tism. It's so good, y'all. It's literally like the Onion. It's like this parody kind of publication thing. Like, oh, it's so good. But that one is there's a lot of sarcasm built into their articles and such, right? And then some autistics struggle with understanding sarcasm, but also, quite frankly, some neurotypical struggle as well, depending on their culture and how sarcasm comes off and who you are, right? It can be troublesome there. And then, yeah, there's just a lot of difference between certain social norms, sensory processing differences, which I talk about in more the individual side of my Venn diagram, which I've already done. I talked about sensory profiles and stuff. You can check that video out there in that playlist. These things all lead to more and more misunderstanding, is essentially the point here, okay? So let's talk a little bit about what empathy is. So typically in colloquial settings, in just our everyday life, when we talk about having empathy, usually people are talking about essentially feeling the feelings of others, right? It's that beyond just sympathy. It's not just the verbalization of like, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. It's actually genuinely feeling bad when you hear that something bad happened to somebody. Okay. Now, in cognitive science and like psychology and stuff, especially, it's actually been understood that there's really three components to empathy. Okay. So you have the emotional slash affective empathy where you're actually feeling someone's emotional state. Okay. That is the one that people really think of as being empathy. That's usually the one thing people genuinely think of. But there's also cognitive empathy. So the ability to kind of put yourself in their shoes and think, gosh, that would be really hard for me. I don't think I can handle going through that. Wow, that sounds awful. That can be a cognitive empathy thing, right? Where you can understand their viewpoints and their thoughts, and it makes sense that they're upset about it because it's like it cognitively makes sense because it's like obviously that's a really unfair or really awful situation or whatever, right? Thinking of bad things. That's usually when we think of empathy is when something bad is happening, but we can also have empathy for good things too, like when people have good news, right? And then there's also the compassionate side of empathy, which is essentially the doing side. It's the side where you actually act a certain way to show that you care about that person, to show that you want to support them, right? And so I think for a lot of autistics and for some ADHDers and for myself with my little mixed neurotype situation going on all up in here, the cognitive empathy sometimes is the one that's like the emotional empathy can actually be kind of hard, especially if you have something called alexithymia, which is in my 11 different brain differences you need to know about episode there. But alexithymia is the inability to either recognize or label your feelings or the feelings of others. And the reason it makes the feeling part of empathy difficult is because for the same reason you might have a hard time if you have alexithymia, you're going to have a hard time identifying your emotions. And then the same sort of brain regions that help us to become aware and understand our emotions also connect very deeply to the part of the brain, the insula, if you want to know. It's a cortical area that's kind of temporal lobe area, but it's like kind of tucked in under a few folds there. And that has a lot to do with the feeling side of empathy, which we know from lesion studies in humans, which means people who've had some sort of atrophy in that area or an injury to the insula, they show an issue having this feeling side of empathy and really understanding what someone's feeling. Okay. And that can cause a problem if you have alexithymia. Alexithymia is also very prevalent with autistics, and it's also very, very prevalent with victims of trauma. Somebody with some kind of trauma response, whether it's actually diagnosed PTSD or not, or complex PTSD or whatever, trauma creates that disconnect between the emotive part of our brain that like generates reactions due to things and the conscious parts of our brain where we're aware of those emotions. There's a disconnect there. So obviously that becomes a difficult part right there. Now, if you have trouble with the feeling part of that empathy, you can still develop the cognitive empathy. You might still be able to take the perspective as long as you understand the situation well enough, which means for an autistic, for example, or maybe someone with a trauma response who doesn't have the emotional part, maybe they need to ask a lot more questions to understand the cognitive empathy side. But that can come off as cold to someone who expects the feeling side, right? If you need to ask, like, well, why would you be upset about that? Like, if you're confused as to why they would be having this reaction and you want to ask them questions about that, if this is like a significant other, like a romantic partner or something, that might come off as cold and callous to them because they're expressing their upset and they just don't want to have to explain every detail of it because maybe it'll make them more upset, like there can be a lot of things going on there too. So then you end up with this misunderstanding. And then if you look at the compassionate side, the doing side of empathy, autistics, the way they show that they care for people is often very different from neurotypical expectations. Like the default instinct, the way we like to show that we care. Most neurodivergents I know like to do things for people, okay? But not like the standard. We don't think of doing things that just like socially show you care. We usually want to do something more specific. We want to do something more for that person specifically, right? So it's like kind of like how, even I see this with like little kids, for example. Okay, if I go to like when I worked with preschoolers, autistic preschoolers, they'll do that thing where, if one person's upset, they'll bring their favorite toy to that person, right? Because it's like, this makes me feel better. Maybe it'll help them feel better. And that's kind of how they do it, right? But as they grow up and they gain a little more perspective, maybe a little more perspective taking of somebody, and they learn a little more of somebody's likes and dislikes, instead of bringing their favorite toy, they might bring something that that person likes, right? It might be more of that suggestion of like, oh, you're upset. Let's go watch this show you enjoy. Yeah, tell me which show you want to watch so we can do something you enjoy and you can feel better, right? That might be a way of showing that they have compassion or empathy. And they might not have the instinct to, get the person flowers or hug them or, right? That might not be the instinct. The instinct might be, I'm going to show that I know you and that I'm here and that I care about you by like asking if you want something you like, if that would, like here's something you like, right? And then if that gets shown as like cold or diverting things because the person wanted, maybe the other person wanted a hug and they didn't ask for it and the autistic didn't think to give one, then that can cause a big issue, right? A big fight or misinterpretation there, right? So Damien Milton was essentially onto something, is what I'm saying here. He was essentially onto something. Now, even people with like antisocial personality disorder, which I think used to formerly be sociopathy, would be more of like the diagnosis there, like sociopaths, if you hear about that. That's a word that's still used a lot. I don't think it's the preferred term, though, at this moment. But even people with that can still learn the cognitive empathy side and they can learn the like showing empathy side of empathy, right? They still might not have the feeling side, but they can still learn to demonstrate it. They can learn to think and take perspective and like, right? And so too can neurodivergents. And quite frankly, so too can neurotypicals if they're open and willing to learn how an autistic might show these sides, right? So if you think of it in this sense as a difference, think of it almost more like a cultural difference, right? There are huge cultural differences across the world of how different people in different places show empathy and do things to show empathy. There are huge cultural differences. East Asian cultures are very different from Western cultures when it comes to how to demonstrate this stuff, right? How to demonstrate you care about somebody. What that looks like can be very different from like a collectivist society to more of an individualistic society, for example, right? And once you zoom in and get even more nuance, there's even way more nuance, even within like more individualistic societies. There can still be so many other factors and nuances for how people might demonstrate empathy. And then you also have to consider the differences of like relationship status. Is this a stranger? Is this just someone you've just met? Is this a family member, right? There can be huge differences there too. So there's a lot of complexity there with how we demonstrate, how we're expected to demonstrate empathy, how we're expected to feel it or think it, and what we're expected to just know to do to help, right? And it gets really confusing in general. But if you have a brain that your wiring, your instinct of how to show empathy is seen as you being too analytical or too cold or not having enough feeling or willfully ignoring it or whatever, then yeah, you know, then yeah, that causes a lot of issues with developing close friendships, close relationships. But it also creates this real sense of isolation for the neurodivergent themselves, right? Like if I'm having a hard time and somebody comes at me with a certain societal expectation to show empathy, but it wasn't something I ever really expected, or maybe it doesn't have as much practical application for me, I might not receive that thing with quite as much of a appreciation for it, right? You know, if it's just like, I'm feeling really bad, so somebody bought me some flowers. Flowers are lovely and they're nice. And now that I'm older, I know what that means. But when I was younger, especially as like a teenager or a young adult, I might have been like, well, the flowers are nice, but they're not really going to fix anything, right? Although, totally side note, this also makes me think of like toxic positivity stuff where people want to brush off things and not actually give any space to pain. And that's not really showing empathy, to be quite frank. I'm gonna be honest. I don't think that's really showing empathy. But also, that is one way that will always kind of annoy me, right? Like if I'm getting to know somebody and they immediately go toward like more of a toxic positivity, just don't think about what's hard and just only focus on the positive and brr, 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 then I'm just sort of like, all right, fine, you're not someone I'm going to go to about serious stuff because I want to be more honest and upfront about it. I like confronting problems rather than like just ignoring them and hoping they go away because they don't usually go away. It's the thing about problems. It's like that the cat came back song slash sketch thing.
They thought he was a goner, but the cat came back. He just wouldn't stay away.
That's what problems are like the cat that just keeps coming back. What a lot of the current research on double empathy problem now, kind of where we've gotten to, is that yes, this creates a difference in how autistics display compassion and empathy, and it's actually branched off a little more into just social interaction in general, and how if you match the neurotypes to each other, so autistics with autistics, and you just let them socialize in a room together, there's not nearly as many miscommunications between each other. Same thing if you match ADHD to ADHD, not very many miscommunications. Neurotypical to neurotypical, not very many miscommunications. When you mix the neurotypes, that's where a lot of the miscommunications start to happen. That's where there's more communication breakdowns, misunderstandings, not quite getting somebody's expression, et cetera, et cetera. So there seems to be something fairly instinctually wired about certain brain types, certain neurotypes, that allow them to communicate more effectively with each other than they do with people who have just differently wired brains. Which kind of gets at, this is something I probably will make a separate video on, where like I do believe there is an argument to be made here for like autistic culture and like ADHD culture, little subcultures within neurodivergency. I think there's an argument to be made there because a lot of culture comes from people's social expectations and social interactions. And if that's inherent to how your brain is wired, makes sense that little subculture might be pretty different than the broader culture that you grew up in, for example. The idea here behind a lot of this research now is to, encourage more reciprocal understanding, to have certain treatment paradigms where we really appreciate the fact that there are differences here and that there's learning to be had on both sides, right? So like autistics need to learn, but so do the allistics. It's not all on the autistic to do all of the effort and make all of the effort for somebody else. And actually, I believe I'm going to have to find this comment on my YouTube channel. I want to say it was one of my shorts where somebody said that like it was, I believe, a late diagnosed adult who was like, they feel like they have to do all the empathy display and they have to like do so much more effort and empathetic effort toward neurotypicals because they have to like, advocate for themselves, educate the neurotypical, display comfort to the neurotypical when they feel bad that they didn't, that they maybe hurt the autistic's feelings or caused additional stress. And now the neurotypical feels really bad about that. So you have to do more comforting and stuff. So there's all this extra like cognitive and emotional effort and labor that goes into it. Even if you're, what would we call a low support need autistic and you're working and an independent adult, there's still a lot of extra work to be done there. Which, side note, is extremely parallel. There's a lot of parallels there with a lot of other marginalized groups and how they have to do some level of educating, advocating, and comforting people who are not in their group. There's a lot of parallels there. So systemic oppression wise, yeah, that's one of the like kind of core signs that, yeah, neurodivergents are a bit on the marginalized side because we have to take on a lot of the burdens, which is kind of funny because people consider us not capable enough or smart enough or whatever to do those things, while at the same time expecting us to take on a lot more burden, which is not cool. And actually, I'm going to continue that side note a little bit because on a similar vein, as a preschool speech language pathologist, I noticed like one of the things that started kind of bothering me almost about it was I would teach kids about like regulation and give them visuals to help them request wants and needs when it comes to sensory needs and sensory profiles, and how to help their body if it's like, getting too upset or something, so they don't have to have a full on meltdown, right? Trying to avoid meltdowns because meltdowns aren't fun anyway. Might as well learn to not do that. And there was usually a point with a lot of these kids where they got so good at recognizing things genuinely, right? If I gave them the space and the time to think about it and like modeled it a lot for myself, like how I'm feeling that day, and this is what I need for my body, and then asking them what they need for their body, and like balancing that stuff out. After a few months, what would usually happen is these kids would be so good at it that I had to be honest with them, just with my own little brain. I had to be honest with them, and I had to tell them that they're better at calming their body than some of the adults that are taking care of them in the classroom. They're better at it than some of the teachers. I'm going to be honest, you know? And I thought about that when I was reflecting on that like, we put so much burden on like even preschoolers, if they're autistic or otherwise some other neurodivergent. We put so much responsibility on even preschoolers' shoulders to tell us what they need, right? Because if they have a meltdown, it might get interpreted as a tantrum. It might be interpreted as manipulative when it's not. But because of that, in order to help them feel more safe, I tried to give them tools and communication and awareness so that they can communicate their needs to staff and stuff, right? But then, like, I don't know. I feel like it's a little left up, quite frankly, that we're expecting like 3.5-year-olds to do way more work when it comes to regulation and requesting wants and needs than we expect of like adult staff members. I feel like that's a little misbalanced there, right? And we put so much more on them to be able to do that than we even would put on like more of a neurotypical preschooler or preschooler who's experiencing more of that traditional development or whatever. We don't expect nearly as much from them as we do from the neurodivergent preschoolers. So, yeah, talk about societal stigma. Anyway, it's just was one of those things that started to bother me after a while. That's the main thing with double empathy, is that like when an autistic is showing empathy, they might show it in the type of like, here's something that helps me, maybe it'll help you, or here's something I know you like, so I'm going to send you that. I know you like cute dog videos, so I found some. Here's a playlist of cute dog videos for you because you're going through a hard time. That's a little more of the active empathy and compassion from like an autistic perspective versus, maybe they don't really want to call because maybe being on a phone call is a little hard for them, and they don't necessarily want to call and listen to it because maybe that might be kind of hard. And maybe the autistic also themselves doesn't see that as a very practical solution to the problem, but they still want to show that they care. So maybe they'll be like, yeah, here's a place of cute animals because I know you like that and that'll help you feel better, right? Which is extremely sweet and extremely compassionate, in my opinion, but might not come off that way to some, right? And because of these inherent brain wiring differences that lead to different communication styles, the cognitive perspective taking can be just so different in the way that a neurotypical might express that they're upset versus the way an autistic might express that they're going through a tough time. There just might be such a different way of communicating that. And I will probably do a different video to dive more into some of that research because the conversational part is fascinating to me as a visual anthropologist. Because when I'm around my fellow neurodivergent queer friends, we look like the way the papers describe neurodivergents talk. Like we interrupt each other, we talk over each other, we info dump constantly. Nobody gets insulted by being interrupted. It's just part of the vibe. It's like, whatever. And you can literally, like, if you do get interrupted and you remember to finish your thought, like 40 minutes later, it's like, okay, everybody's fine with that. You really don't have to communicate that hard. You don't have to correct it or, explain it to people as much. But outside of that context, outside of that little subculture of mine, I've got to do a little bit more effort to like bridge some of these gaps. And I try to do it sort of proactively, especially since my speech pathology training. I do try to do it sort of proactively and like maybe that leads me to kind of over explain certain things or use a lot of qualifiers like before and after and maybe and I don't know. But um it is something I've noticed myself doing that makes things a little bit different. So interesting that thanks to my training, I think I just inherently try to bridge double empathy as much as I can. So, which I was not as good at before getting training as a speech language pathologist. I was pretty abysmal at it, actually. I was mostly just very confused as to why people didn't understand my train of thought because it's like, if I'm thinking this way, clearly everyone else does. Turns out that's not the way that goes, but that's kind of how I functioned for a very long time. That was a decent info dump on the double empathy problem. Let's go ahead and review a little bit, okay? So, to summarize in review, the double empathy problem is traditionally attributed to Dr. Damien Milton, who is a researcher in the UK and I believe late diagnosed autistic himself. And he came up with this as a paradigm or as like a sort of shift in how we conceptualize research into autism because prior research focused so heavily on the deficit model of looking at like if autistics aren't displaying empathy the way we expect to see it, it must not be happening. Therefore, they're not having empathy, which is kind of bizarre because out of the three components of empathy, two of them are essentially internal and one of them is display, you know? So he kind of saw it as more like maybe we should figure out what's going on internally with an autistic first before we just assume that lack of display the way we expect the display equals zero empathy. Okay. And further research down this path has shown that, yeah, he was pretty right about that. If you do consider the internal world of autistics, and also if you match autistic to autistic, empathy is there and it gets clearly communicated. It breaks down more when you have mixed neurotypes there, right? Um, This also, I think, got picked up a lot by autistic advocates because it's a great way to try to explain that there are differences here, core differences that you might see this person as weird or quirky or cold or off-putting or, antisocial or whatever. And you might, especially on social media, people might do little armchair diagnoses because for some reason, I saw this on Tumblr once and it's so totally valid. For some reason, the only people who are really qualified to diagnose people's psychological situation are trained psychologists, neuropsychologists, and random commenters on the internet. Apparently, that's the other group that has total authority to say if someone's faking or not, right? People are like, we don't like self diagnoses, but we're diagnosing you. And it's like, who are you? How are you doing that? That's weird. Why do you think you have that authority? So bizarre. I don't quite get how that works, but okay. Essentially, people have been picking this up as a way to hopefully teach people about these differences so that we can start to bridge this gap, right? So that like autistics and ADHDers and other neurodivergents don't have to feel so way out there compared to other people. And I think maybe one of the hardest things in terms of bridging this sort of double empathy gap is that neurotypicals really just if people outside of neurodivergent, the neurodivergent realm could be more curious about the internal state of autistics and ADHDers and other people, if they could be more curious, if they could see it as more of like a maybe there's just a cultural difference between how we're displaying empathy, and maybe I need to sort of reach across and try to understand how they're demonstrating it, right? Then I think we would bridge things a lot more. But that in and of itself is so unexpected in a lot of Western culture, at least in the US and such, that like it very rarely happens. It's like the neurotypical almost feels like they're being rude, having to ask, like, do you care about this? But honestly, most autistics aren't insulted by that type of question. That's part of that perspective taking. If you're doing like really kind of straightforward questions to try to take their perspective, that's usually more appreciated than making assumptions. So a little more curiosity, a little more active compassion in that sense, a little more active that, and then just kind of listening and learning a little more. Hopefully that helps. And if you want me to do a deeper dive into communication differences and kind of how I see some of this brain difference wiring to explain perhaps more cultural difference, then a neurological disorder, let me know in a comment below, and I will be happy to do so because I have many articles on my computer currently ready to go. And I actually have a whole training slide deck that I've done at a couple of conferences that I could use as part of that explanation. It's kind of already ready, so let me know. Outside of that, I hope you have some self-compassion and some empathy for yourself. Take a breath, do something good for yourself, and then let's all embrace our weirdness powers, the good weirdness. Let's embrace that weirdness for good, to use it as a way to connect with each other and create more community. And in that spirit, keep it weird. And until next time. Bye. I'm too weird for algorithms, guys, so comment, like, subscribe, do all those things to help these videos dig out to more people. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!